In this video, we're going to be discussing more basic grips for the Tai Chi straight sword. In our last video, we talked about several different ones. This video, we're going to be covering 3 different grips that are commonly used for the Tai Chi straight sword. If you haven't seen the previous video, go ahead and check that out, maybe before or after watching this one. In that video, I discussed my favorite grip for the Tai Chi straight sword, and in this one, we're going to be talking about, toward the end, we're going to be talking about my second favorite grip. So there's a link to the previous video down in this video's description, and be sure to stick around to the end of this video so that you can see my second favorite grip for the Tai Chi straight sword. We're going to discuss a few more sword grips that we didn't talk about in the last video. The first one that I want to talk about is used frequently for spins and really just fancy looking movements with the sword. And it's basically just taking your index finger and your thumb and using that as your main grip, and the other fingers are there for support. That's really useful for spins. You keep those 2 fingers as your main contact, and the other fingers are just kind of there for support and to help tilt the blade so that it goes where you want it to go. You also see this one a lot when people are doing vertical sword postures. And the idea is with those top 2 fingers holding on to the sword, the other ones can position in a way that gets the sword to the right. And so it looks really good when you're doing a movement and you're able to, get the sword exactly where you're wanting it, and you have this cool looking hand posture on the sword or grip on the sword. It's not a very uncommon way of holding the straight sword, but it's also not a very useful way of holding the straight sword unless you're just wanting to do spins and do fancy movements. So it's not a stable way of holding the sword. If this is all I'm holding on with, the sword can flop around quite easily, and those fingers just lightly touching somewhere to try to give it some amount of stability is not going to be the same as if you have a good grip on the sword. That's going to give you a lot of stability. If you're doing partner drills or sword sparring, anything like that, and you have a good grip on the sword, then if the sword's, hit suddenly or something happens that could knock it out of your hand or make you lose control of the blade, it's not likely to happen. If you're just holding on with those 2 fingers and the other ones are just there for support, there's a lot that can happen there that isn't well controlled. And so that's one of the reasons why this grip is good for performance and something that you would want to use if you're doing something like a sword spin, because a spin like that's going to be very difficult if you're holding on tight. It can be done, and it's going to be less likely to, if you were using that as a parry, it's going to be less likely for your sword to get knocked out of your hand or for you to lose control of the blade if you're holding on with a more solid grip and using more of the wrist rather than holding on with these 2 fingers and using that pivot point for the spin. Another reason why that's not a great grip is if you're doing one of those vertical sword postures. The reason for a posture like this is to do a cut. You're pulling up as you're coming back, so you're using this part of the blade to cut up and under something. So that can be up under the wrist that's holding your opponent's weapon. That can be cutting to the groin, to the inside of the leg, to a leg that's kicking, up under the arm. Depending on what your target is with that, that can be a cut coming up. If that's a cut coming up, and you have just this flimsy grip with those 2 fingers, when it comes up, the momentum of the sword, these are typically fairly light swords, the momentum of that sword coming up typically isn't going to be enough to finish that cut, and so you're going to hit your target and the sword's going to be more likely to bounce back. If you have a stronger grip on the sword and you come up for that cut, then you're able to support the movement of the sword with a stronger grip. So for the purpose of parrying, it's not a great grip. For the purpose of cutting up, it's not a great grip. For the purpose of using this as a deflection, if you have this sort of grip, it's not ideal, because these deflections, if a sword attack is coming in straight, you can bring the sword up on either side of the attacking sword to deflect it. Now, if you're doing that and you're just holding on like this with some supporting fingers, the chances of that deflection actually working are really low, because you don't have something kind of solid to put in the way of the trajectory of your opponent's blade. So as it's coming in, you're going to come up to deflect it, and then your sword's probably going to move because they'll probably have a better grip on their sword than what you have with this 2-finger grip. So a quick recap: this grip, where you're using the index finger and the thumb right at the base of the hilt, is great for spins. It can look really cool when you're doing a form, but it's not a very good grip because it's not very stable and it doesn't support your sword movement very well. The next movement is sort of a variation on the previous one that we just talked about. And instead of using your index finger and thumb to grip the sword, you're leaving the index finger a little loose, and you're using the middle finger and the thumb to grip the sword. And all the other fingers are there gripping loosely, but not holding on tight. And the point of that is that you can easily switch how you're holding the sword. This is your anchor point, the middle finger and the thumb, and then the rest of these can be changed as they need to be to accommodate whatever movement you're doing. So this is a little better than the last one, mainly because the middle finger and thumb grip is going to be a lot stronger than the index finger and thumb grip, but you're also at a disadvantage because you're just using 2 fingers again to really hold the sword in place, and then the other ones are there in supporting roles. So again, it's probably better than the last one, but it's not necessarily the best hand grip that you can have. I would say the main strengths of this grip, as opposed to the last one that we talked about, is that the fingers you're using are stronger and the other fingers are there in a supporting role that can be changed as needed for the technique that you're doing. You still have the index finger available up toward the top, so you can control the angle of the blade quite well. The other fingers are looser, so if you need to do sort of a straight up and down vertical grip, you can still support it, but then you also have a little bit more spread of the hand across the handle, so it's a little more stable. It's not as easy to do spins with this grip, but it can be done. I would say just try it, play with it, see if this is a grip that works for you. It's not one that I use regularly, and it's probably not one that I would use regularly. So as a quick recap on that grip, it's the middle finger and the thumb that are gripping. The index finger and ring and pinky are held somewhat loosely to support the movement of the sword and allow it to be not loose in your hand, but not held so tightly that it can't move freely in the way that you want it to without losing control. The last sword grip that we're going to talk about in this video is very similar to the last one, and instead of keeping the middle finger and the thumb as your anchored grip, you keep the middle finger, the ring finger, and the thumb. So the 3 middle fingers are together gripping the sword, and then you have the index finger and the pinky as sort of your loosely held fingers that can change what they're doing to match the technique that you're doing with the sword. So with this one, it's here, kind of like a Spider-Man hand, and you're pinning across with the thumb over the middle and ring finger. You have the index finger up top, the pinky down below, and those are held more loosely. This one is kind of, if you want like a looser grip, but still a more stable grip, this is the one that I would probably go with, because it has the advantages of a more loose grip as far as being able to be very agile with what you're doing with the sword, but it also lacks some of the disadvantages, which are poor control of the sword and kind of a weak grip. There's a lot that you can do from this grip while still having a good, stable, strong grip on the sword. So for the stability of this grip and the amount of movement that this grip allows you to do with the sword, this is probably my second favorite grip for the straight sword. So in this video, we covered 3 different grips. One was index finger and thumb together at the top to allow for very free movement of the sword, but not great stability, not great control. The second one was moving down to the middle finger and the thumb as the main grip, and that gives a little bit more strength to your grip on the sword and potentially more control because you have the index finger up here as well as fingers down here to control what the sword is doing, but it's still not the most stable grip for a sword. And the third one that we talked about is using the middle finger and the ring finger and the thumb as your main grips, leaving the index finger and the pinky more loose. This also allows for a lot of free movement of the sword without losing control and without sacrificing a strong, stable grip on the sword, so that at no point while you're using the sword do you lose control of the sword. One thing I would like to mention about my favorite grip for the Tai Chi straight sword, which we discussed in the previous video, is that it still allows for you to do a vertical sword posture. It requires you to flex the wrist a little bit more for that, but the taper of the handle actually helps with this. Because the handle is angled this way, so it's kind of coming back like this, it allows you to put your hand at less of an angle to get the sword vertical. If the handle was just straight up and down, then I would have to push my wrist even further to get the sword vertical. But because there's that taper, it allows for me to have that solid grip with the bottom 3 fingers and the thumb and still get the vertical movement of the straight sword and have a stable grip. I hope this video has been useful for you in understanding a little bit more about the grip on a Tai Chi straight sword. If you enjoyed this video and you found it useful and you got something out of it, maybe learned something, do me a favor, hit the like button and also consider subscribing to this channel so that you can see more videos like this. I wish you all the best in your training. Thank you for watching.